Cat City is a national legend and a cherished childhood memory. Surely you remember watching it as a kid and falling in love with the world of the mice, or watching it again as a young man and finding a surprising sort of comfort in its political undertones. Or maybe you watched it one more time just the other day and cast your mind back to the good old days. Wait, you're not from Hungary? In that case, you've probably never heard of this movie, but today is your lucky day, because I'm going to fill you in on what exactly this iconic film is about, whether or not you should spend your precious time watching it, and I'll also dig into exactly what these political undertones are and some other interesting stuff. Finally, before we leave, I'll give this movie a rating on my new patent pending. I'm not sure if it's legal to say that if I don't actually have a patent pending, which I do not. My new patent not pending rating scale, the Tobin rating system. In Hungarian, Cat City is known as, you didn't think I was actually going to try to pronounce that. I'm not from Hungary. In fact, I just ate. So prepare yourself for an outsider's perspective. If you actually have seen this movie, if you actually had one of the experiences I was describing above, I'd love to hear your fond memories of this movie, assuming you have some. Otherwise, let's begin. I've seen some Hungarian films, like the action-packed, the exciting, nail-biting, edge-of-your-seat drama Workmeister Harmonies, directed by Béla Tarr, or The Fifth Seal, directed by Zoltán Fabry. That's an interesting movie. I like both of those, and I like this movie. Cat City is a cartoon. It's not the first time we featured a cartoon on the channel, and in fact, next week, we will be doing another cat-related cartoon. It does not start with a G and end with a Garfield. This movie, Cat City, is sort of a kid's movie. At least it kind of looks like one, has the trappings of one, but I guess there's more to it than that. The main virtues here are probably humor, and as I've already alluded to, a bit of spiciness. Let me start with the easy question, though, which is whether or not this movie is actually funny or fun to watch. Does it even make any sense? Before I answer that, I gotta tell you which version of the movie I watched. Sorry to disappoint everybody, but I watched the English one. I probably wanted to watch the Hungarian one. I would have preferred that, to watch it with subtitles, but I couldn't track down a good copy in time. I actually watched this movie on archive.org. Someone uploaded it there. Is that legal? I don't know. It might be gone by the time you're watching it, but there is a copy there right now. The print is pretty bad, looks old. There have been a couple of great remasters, including one in English from a company called The Deaf Crocodile. If you're interested in watching this movie, maybe get a copy of it from them on Blu-ray. I don't even have a Blu-ray player, honestly, because most of the movies I watch have never been released on Blu-ray. Anyway, I don't speak Hungarian, so even had I watched the subtitled version, I probably would have missed out, probably did miss out, on some of the jokes that you Hungarians would really enjoy. Still, there's quite a few jokes that I think you can't miss. There's some great visual gags in the film, a lot of interesting left turns in the plot, some great twists, and the ending is fantastic. I genuinely enjoyed watching this movie. That said, I wouldn't put it at the top of my list of all-time favorite comedies. It's not exactly a laugh a minute. There were stretches where I wasn't as certain that it was funny. Some of the jokes, I guess, are a bit simplistic. Some of the characters are a bit hokey. And I guess it seems just like kind of a standard kids' movie at times, rather than the legendary and iconic film that it's supposed to be. That said, it's easy to follow and it is fun to watch. I think you'd have a good time. Let's get to the interesting stuff, though. First of all, this movie starts out with a crawl. Cat City came out in 1986, although it's kind of a hard movie to place in time. If you didn't know what year it was from, I'm not sure you'd guess 1986, although if you really know your cartoons, maybe. I guess since this is from the 80s, it would be appropriate to call this a Star Wars-style crawl. In the first few minutes, we are introduced to Mousetropolis. Yes, the movie is called Cat City, but it takes place in a city full of mice. The Hungarian title literally means cat catcher, I think, catcher of cats. It's a little unclear exactly how this world is laid out, who lives where. There's a city that is mainly mice, but it gets raided by cats occasionally, it seems. I'm not sure where the cats live. There is some suggestion of an interplanetary aspect to the story, maybe in line with the Star Wars crawl, but there's no space travel. I didn't quite understand that aspect of it. Maybe someone can explain it to me. These wrinkles, I don't think, are inconsistencies so much as they're sort of fun, absurdist details, part of the fun. Mousetropolis is a fun place. It's a world that really engages the imagination. This is common in sort of kids' anthropomorphized movies, these highly textured animal worlds. They engage the imagination. Now, Mousetropolis doesn't look much like Hungary to me. If anything, it looks like New York. Can you picture that? A city that looks like New York and is filled with millions of mice? Seems implausible. Actually, in the very beginning, it looks a little bit like Los Angeles in 2019, as in Blade Runner. Of course, that also came out a few years before this movie, in fact. Even from the briefest description of the film, as I have just afforded you, perhaps, you may already notice a couple of nods to the West. I'm no expert on the history of Hungary, but in 1986, I think it was reaching the end of a long period of communism. You don't hear as much about communism in Hungary as in other Eastern Bloc countries. I'm not really sure why. I guess Hungary isn't as far east as some places that are farther east. I think maybe it was easier to travel and to be connected with the rest of the Europe. The transition to capitalism in 1989 was non-violent. Nonetheless, this movie still alludes to some political dissatisfaction, I guess. I'm not going to frame the entire thing in terms of communism, but that seems clearly to be some crucial context to the film. I think anyone will notice certain Soviet undertones in the movie. I'm using the term Soviet a little broadly here because Hungary was not part of the Soviet Union at the time, but like I said, some Soviet undertones. For instance, when we meet the cats, they are mainly portrayed as gangsters, organized into an enormous syndicate, and there's a remarkable bureaucracy to their corruption, to the work of this syndicate, a criminal organization, but also a type of government, seemingly two in the same, teetering between government and criminal organization. The good people of Mousetropolis, the good mice of Mousetropolis, I should say, don't appear to have much formal government. I'm sure they do, but the movie doesn't really dwell on it. Instead, we mainly see their secret police in action. Secret police, another kind of Soviet idea. They're not always the good guys, but here, I guess they are. The cats, on the other hand, have this structure that, like I said, teeters between government and gangsterism. This sort of corruption seems a bit Soviet to me, and reminds me, I guess, of some other Eastern Bloc movies, like The Fireman's Ball, directed by Milos Forman. That's a Czechoslovakian movie that very shrewdly captures a certain type of corrupt and perverse power. Same kind of power in this movie, I think. That's a great movie, by the way. There's some more direct details as well. For instance, the cats have surveillance technology that might remind you of something like the lives of others. There are also some interesting didactic moments. For instance, at one point, the cats invent a shrink ray. These are pretty advanced cats, if you haven't noticed. They have a research lab that is always working on some zany ideas. This isn't a spoiler, don't worry. They come up with the shrink ray, and they plan to use it to shrink a cat down to the size of a mouse and have it infiltrate mouse holes where apparently some gold is stored. The mice in this movie, of course, don't really seem to live in holes so much as houses, but apparently they want to infiltrate these holes nonetheless. To test out the contraption, they shrink down a cat and pit it against a captured prisoner of war mouse. What happens? Well, the mouse beats up the cat easily. This is almost a little parable, I think, suggesting that there's something arbitrary about the cat's power. When you shrink it down, it loses to the mouse. If these cats were the size of normal people, normal mice, then they wouldn't have the upper hand at all. Anyway, feels like a little bit of a parable to me. I'm not going to spend the whole time talking about this corruption angle, but I think it's one of the most noticeable things in the movie. Cats and mice on their own, in some ways, have a natural opposition, I guess, although it's interesting that the movie says at the beginning that there's a natural understanding, a natural order between them that the cats are looking to upset because they're too power hungry or something like that. Either way, you don't necessarily have to do a lot to motivate the conflict between a cat and a mouse in a film. Nonetheless, this movie really goes out of its way to portray a certain type of gangster government. I guess it's worth mentioning that not all the cats are totally wicked. One of them has a daughter who is friends with a mouse. Shocking? I know. Hopefully you were seated when I revealed that. This is an interesting touch, I think. A neat piece of nuance, but it doesn't really go much of anywhere. Another thing that's pretty interesting, something I've already touched on a little bit, is the role of technology in this film. The cat research lab does not come off very well in this movie. It gives us a look at technology that is kind of sinister and also kind of ridiculous. On the other hand, the mice also have a laboratory. Can you believe that? And I guess it comes off a little better. So it might seem like we're going a couple of different directions with technology. Is it a laughable frivolity, something darker, something to be paranoid about, an instrument of war? Or is it part of a brighter global future? I think things can get a bit clear here if we think about some other similar movies. Cat City is more than anything a spoof of James Bond. It turns out that the Mouse Lab is in dire need of some secret plans. They have to get them from their agents in Tokyo, which I guess is a real place, despite some of the other places not being real. I don't know. And they need a special mouse agent to get them. Cat City is not the only spoof of James Bond, of course. In the Cold War era, there was basically an entire genre of comedy spy-fi. We've talked about this a little bit on the channel before when I reviewed the kids' film Inspector Gadget. Inspector Gadget, that one. That movie is based on a television show called, you guessed it, Inspector Gadget. Do you know who was the voice of Inspector Gadget in the original television show? None other than Don Adams, who played Maxwell Smart, Secret Agent 86 in Get Smart, which is basically the paradigm for comedy spy-fi, I guess. When I was in middle school, we had a night where everyone dressed up as a historical figure. This was considered to be educational. I dressed up as Don Adams, spent the entire evening speaking into a shoe. I don't think anyone really knew who I was, except maybe one or two of the oldest teachers. Anyway, I'm a big fan of Get Smart, the show, never seen the movies, and like I said, that's kind of the peak of spy-fi comedy. Well, the most salient example. I won't try to convince you that it's actually a good show. I'm not going to divert us too far here, but basically Cat City, I think, has a very similar thing going on, which maybe isn't too surprising because one of the main things about spy-fi is that it's really a Cold War genre. So there is some paranoia and anxiety about the war, about new power relationships, and certain reconfigurations of society. At the same time, these movies also kind of lavish in urbanity and modernity, gadgets, right? I mean, even in James Bond itself, the gadget angle is kind of campy. It's kind of ridiculous. It's almost bordering on humor when James Bond goes to figure out his new toys, right? That's kind of modernity in film. One of the most salient examples of modernity in film right there is the James Bond gadget. Think about our relationship with technology today, though. People like it, but it also seems like maybe it is destroying us. Think about our phones, TikTok, or generative AI. It's common to have contradictory feelings about these things. I don't think those examples are quite the same as some of the Cold War technology, which was so closely tied to war and killing people, or going to the moon, but it's an interesting comparison. Technology is really in the foreground of this movie, and like I said, at first it might seem a little weird, but I think it kind of falls back into this spy-fi idea, which maybe is a bit weird, but yeah, this contradictory time for technology, much like it is right now. Okay, there's one more big thing I wanted to talk about, which is the role of internationalism and race in this movie. Let's start with the good news. This movie takes us all over the place. It's international, just like James Bond is international. I mentioned we go to Japan. Yes, the other cities are also filled with mice, even the one called Catville. Catville, to me, looked a bit like Las Vegas. I don't know. Maybe I'm making that up. The idea of international travel, the idea of globe-trotting, may have been especially poignant from behind the Iron Curtain. This movie takes us on a couple of planes. It's interesting to compare aviation behind the Iron Curtain to aviation in America, both in terms of commercial stuff and military stuff. There's actually an aircraft hijacking in this movie, it doesn't really seem like a big deal. Obviously, things would be a bit different if this movie was made in the United States today or any time after approximately 2001. Airplane hijackings were somewhat common during the Cold War, though, even in the United States. In fact, there's a story about Alan Funt, the creator of Candid Camera, flying on a plane that was hijacked. The passengers thought it was a stunt for the show and wouldn't take it seriously, apparently, at least. It's a story. Who knows if it really happened. The hijackers there were aiming for a very typical hijacking destination, which was Cuba. Hopefully that didn't just demonetize the video. Don't hijack a plane, kids. It's very rarely successful these days. There is also a scene on board a cargo ship in this movie. That's interesting. We've got this big commercial aviation international apparatus here, and we've also got this shipping apparatus. Two things that I guess today we really take for granted. But what did people think about these things from behind the Iron Curtain? I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to leave the plane thing here a little bit and get back to the international characters. The not-so-great news about these guys is that some of the characters maybe haven't aged that well. There's a group of rats in the film, some of the bad guys, that are loosely patterned off, I guess, some kind of Motown band. In fact, they have a musical intro, the Gang of Four. So these rats are, I guess, kind of coded as black. There are also some bats that are Mexican. They are basically walking, or flying, stereotypes. Something along the lines of Speedy Gonzales, although admittedly not quite that fast. Maybe it comes off a little differently in the Hungarian version, I'm not sure. First, personally, I found it more interesting than everything, than anything. But that's my response to everything, so take that with a grain of salt. I wonder by what means these stereotypes made their way to Hungary in the 1980s. I'm not trying to say that the place is from another planet, but I wonder why certain things would have been more salient than others. It's possible that Speedy Gonzales is part of the answer, because I suspect that some of the elements in this movie came through the Hollywood pipeline. Some of the sound effects, for instance, they sound like American sound effects. That doorbell, it sounds like an American doorbell. That screech of tires, that sounds like those are good American Goodyear tires. Maybe the sound effects are different in the English version again. But there's a conspicuously sort of Western thing about the movie. I mean, I said that even in the very beginning, and that is also true in the form a little bit. The movie has good music, I think. At times, it would sound right at home in an American cartoon, but in other ways, it kind of has a Soviet tinge to it. I have listened to much more Eastern European popular music from the 60s, 70s, and 80s than the average person who is not from Eastern Europe. I used to be a big fan of Prolivo Kazalista, for instance. Don't know how to pronounce that, but I like the music. What can I say? That's a band that sounds like it's from Eastern Europe. They're not from Hungary, but it sounds Eastern European. But it also sounds like they spent a lot of time listening to American Top 40 radio. This push and pull is really fascinating to me, and I think that's kind of happening in this movie as well. Very common in international cultural products. In some ways, the story of a lot of international movies is the story of that country's relationship to Hollywood. Not to be American-centric here, but the influence was undoubtable. It's kind of ironic that at the time, some of the cachet of these songs and movies would have come perhaps, maybe subconsciously, from their ties to America, where today it might be the other way around. I think this movie is cool because it's from someplace else, right? Ultimately, you know, when people talk about this movie, they talk about it with some form of national pride, I think. This was a movie this was Hungary's submission to the Academy Awards in 1986 or 1987. Wasn't an accepted submission, and maybe that shows you just how many other movies were being made there at the time. But like I said, when people talk about this, when you see reviews about it, people talk about it as one of the best things, one of the best movies, right? With some sort of pride. And that's interesting because it is, in some ways, a distinctly national film. A film that maybe in some ways even transcends the government of the time to tell a story of people, I guess. But at the same time, it's kind of an international, kind of a Western film, right? And it's interesting that it should be about James Bond because that should be a spoof on James Bond because this internationalism is such a salient undertone to those original movies. Okay. Overall, I like Cat City. I wasn't sure that it was even going to make any sense to me, but it's actually very easy to follow and fun to watch. I probably missed some of the jokes, and I wouldn't call it a slam dunk comedy. At times, it does seem like a kid's movie, but on the other hand, it has some interesting undertones, which I think are fairly easy to pick up on, and it makes for a heck of a lot more interesting viewing than the average 80s American kids cartoon film, I guess. So I'm now going to give this movie a score on my patent not pending scoring scale, the Tobin rating system. This is the first time I've done this, the inaugural score, and I think we're going to start things off with a very respectable 16. Like I said, next week we have another cat cartoon that I think is going to make this one look pretty tame, make this one look like a house cat. You can probably already guess what that is. I'm excited to watch it and maybe even to tell you guys about it.